Bueno, muy buenos días para todos. Bienvenidos a nuestro evento Accountability en el liderazgo. Para iniciarlos quiero invitar a ver un video de Lee Hecht Harrison.
El mundo global avanza y cambia constantemente, haciendo que el entorno de negocios sea volátil, incierto, complejo y ambiguo. Un mundo VICA, en el que su compañía cada día se enfrenta con mayores retos. Lee Hecht Harrison, compañía líder mundial en transición de carrera y desarrollo de talento y liderazgo, es su aliado para lograr las transformaciones que demanda el mundo VICA. Tenemos los procesos y herramientas de última generación que le permitirán alcanzar los resultados de negocio mientras se reduce los riesgos. Más de 20 años en Colombia nos da la experiencia para acompañarlo en estas transformaciones. Tenemos la capacidad de integrar o trabajar de manera independiente los 4 componentes clave en procesos de transformación y mejora organizacionales. Transición de carrera. Somos la compañía número 1 del mundo experta en transición. Contamos con las mejores prácticas y las últimas tecnologías que le permiten realinear su fuerza laboral, mirando los intereses de la compañía y de los individuos para lograr la mejor transición posible. Gestión de cambio. Viabilizamos los procesos de cambio que permiten alcanzar el plan estratégico de cada compañía a través del desarrollo de la capacidad de cambio en la organización. Gerencia de carrera. Ayudamos a alinear los objetivos de carrera con los objetivos de las organizaciones. Desarrollo de talento y liderazgo. A través de un proceso integral basado en plataformas y tecnologías de última generación, desarrollamos la capacidad de liderazgo en los diferentes niveles de la organización. Lee Hecht Harrison. Mejores carreras, mejores líderes, mejores negocios.
Ahora los quiero invitar a ver un video de ADECO. Bueno, y para dar la bienvenida a nuestro evento, quiero invitar a Juan Carlos Linares, el presidente de Lee Hecht Harrison Colombia.
Bueno, buenos días a todos. Y muchas gracias por la asistencia. Y quería comentarles pues que hace más o menos unos 2 años, en una reunión de Lee Hecht en Estados Unidos, cuando escuché a Vince hablar del tema que hoy viene a comentarnos, le dije, hay que ir a Colombia, porque el tema de lo que tiene que ver con el liderazgo, el tema de rendición de cuentas o el liderazgo, es algo que uno viene escuchando continuamente con todos ustedes, en las comunidades de recursos humanos, con los presidentes de las compañías, y eso es el tema que nos trae hoy, y basado en la investigación que Vince ha hecho a nivel global con su equipo desde Estados Unidos en el tema de accountability de los líderes en las organizaciones. Y el formato pues, que pensamos para hoy no fue una presentación magistral, sino cuando hablamos también con Mauricio Rodríguez, que nos va a acompañar el día de hoy, fue un formato en que Mauricio, que es una persona que ha investigado mucho el tema de liderazgo desde tiempos atrás, nos acompañara generando una entrevista con Vince, de tal manera que se tocaran temas y que ustedes también estuvieran expuestos a hacer todo tipo de preguntas después del evento en que Mauricio hará una entrevista a Vince y después tendremos un formato de preguntas. ¿Por qué ADECO está acá? Y les quería comentar también, nuestra firma y ADECO son la misma organización. Lee Hecht Harrison pertenece al grupo ADECO y pues muy agradecido con Joan Solana, el presidente de ADECO, que quiso sumarse al patrocinio de este evento hoy acá y a todo su equipo en Bogotá. Antes de empezar, pues quisiera hacerles una introducción sobre Mauricio y sobre Vince. Mauricio, pues yo creo que más de ustedes lo han visto en muchos eventos en televisión. Hace poco pues lo vimos prestándole un gran servicio al país en la aproximación del gobierno con el ELN para empezar las conversaciones de paz. Mauricio, para darles una idea de su hoja de vida, que es bastante extensa, pero la voy a resumir al máximo, pues fue fundador y director de portafolio durante 14 años, rector del CESA, embajador ante el Reino Unido, consejero del presidente Santos, asesor del alcalde Peñalosa, profesor en la Universidad de los Andes, ha escrito varios libros sobre el tema de liderazgo, 8 libros en total, y de ahí que la importancia de que Mauricio nos acompañara en el día de hoy. Y como yo le comentaba, aparte de esto que está público, tal vez las mejores experiencias de liderazgo o con las que estuvimos Mauricio y yo expuestos en distintos años fue del colegio donde vinimos. Los monjes benedictinos norteamericanos nos enseñaron tal vez los primeros temas sobre el servicio del líder a una comunidad. Y por otro lado, pues aquí nos acompaña Vince Molinaro. Vince es el director global de las soluciones de desarrollo de liderazgo de Lee Hecht a nivel global. Y muy agradecido con Vince porque la agenda de él es súper apretada. La próxima semana yo creo que va a estar como en 4 o 5 ciudades en Europa. Antes de llegar acá estaba en otro continente. Y lo que Vince nos va a compartir hoy en día pues es todos sus años de experiencia asesorando a grandes corporaciones a nivel global y basado también en lo que hemos investigado y hemos encontrado, que el caso colombiano, qué es accountability para las organizaciones en Colombia y cómo nos visualizamos eso frente al tema y qué hay que hacer para introducirlo de lleno en nuestras organizaciones. Así que pues, sin más, le doy la palabra a Vince. Vince nos va a hacer como una introducción al tema y después pasamos ya a la sección donde Mauricio y Vince van a estar hablando del tema para finalmente, en los papeles que ustedes tienen aquí, en estos papeles, para que formulen las preguntas que consideren al final de la presentación de ellos dos, las vamos a recoger y Mauricio va a escoger algunas de las preguntas que considere, porque seguramente no va a haber tiempo para todas, y muchas van a ser similares. Así que, pues de nuevo muchas gracias y damos inicio aquí.
Thank you. Good morning, everybody. Or should I say buenos dias? That's better. I'm almost bilingual. I want to thank Juan Carlos and Angela and the whole team at Lee Hecht Harrison here at Adecco for what has been an amazing week to be here in your country, to be here in this city. And yesterday we were in Medellin also with a number of business leaders and HR leaders. And it's just been exciting to be in this great country. And so I'm honored to be here, and thank you for coming this morning. So what we're going to do is spend about 20 minutes or so talking about this issue that we've realized in our work with our organizations around accountability and leadership. And LHH is a global company. We work with leaders around the world. And we were starting to notice a few years ago a challenge that many of our companies, clients were starting to face. I remember particularly one time I went into an organization. It was a financial services company. And I was there to meet the head of human resources. And in the meeting, she was very frustrated. And she said to me, I thought we did all the right things when it came to leadership development. And I asked her, what did you do? Well, we identified the people in our company who we thought were the leaders of the future. And we invested heavily in their development. We coached them, we assessed them, we sent them to business schools for executive education. And then we promoted them. We made them all vice presidents, and we gave them the compensation and the benefits that come with those positions. And now we're waiting. And I said, what are you waiting for? We're waiting for them to lead. What's happening? Well, they're not. Every day they come to work, and they're always looking to the executive team to make a decision on everything. We have fundamental business challenges. She was getting passionate. We have fundamental business challenges that we expect that they are going to help us solve. And somehow they stand there thinking it's someone else's job. And it's like they don't know what it really means to be a leader. And as soon as she said those words, I said, okay, there's something happening here. And when you do the kind of work we do as consultants, once you realize a new issue that's starting to frustrate your clients, it's surprising how quickly you start seeing the same frustration over and over again. And the frustration was, we're investing heavily in leadership and leadership development because you have to, in a mundo del VICA, you have to, right? And yet, we're not seeing it translate. We're not seeing stronger leadership. We're not seeing more accountability. And that's what we were really trying to understand. And so this is a very important question today, both for your companies and for you individually as leaders. What does it really mean to be a leader today? Because, as you know, the model of leadership is very different than it was a generation ago. A generation ago, when the world was not as volatile, not as complex, not as uncertain, you could have one or two very strong leaders at the top who knew their industry well, and they knew the strategy, and all the rest of the leaders just did their jobs. And that was a good model. But today, our clients tell us that model is not sufficient. One or two leaders at the top are not going to have all the answers. And we need leadership to be strong at the top, at the middle, at the front line. We need strength at every level. So this is a really important question for us to spend some time thinking about. So this is going to be the first little activity that you're going to do. So you're going to turn to your left, turn to your right, find a partner, and just spend a very quick 1 minute, maybe 2, thinking about what's your answer to this question. How would you answer this question today in your own leadership role? And your challenge is to try to answer that question only using one word. Can you do that? Okay, so it's going to be very quick because I don't have a lot of time. Very quick conversation, 1 minute. Introduce yourself if you haven't already. This is an opportunity for you to network. Go.
Claro, una palabra. ¿Cuál es su palabra? Liderazgo en una palabra. Servir. Acaba de decir. Transformar positivamente. Trascender. Muy bien, hecha la tarea. y los 300 que no vinieron, 250 que no vinieron, recibieron información, una carta explicando y con un brochure y tal. Se les manda un video resumiendo la vaina, o una USB, alguna cosa. Va a ver que le va a pegar un empujón inmenso a la empresa.
Okay, 10 more seconds.
Métame ahí como, ¿qué se llama eso? Consultor asociado, como... Estoy haciendo eso casi todas las semanas.
Okay, let's close the conversation. Very good, thank you. Okay, so we do this activity a lot, and it's surprising, no matter where I am, very similar words come out. So let me throw some out and see if we're aligned here. So what we hear a lot of is we need leaders today to be inspirational. Anyone talked about inspiration? Yes. We need leaders really to have vision. Few? We need leaders who can empower their teams, who have courage, who collaborate to get work done, who are externally focused, thinking about the world, who are kind of human, right? They get to know their people at a personal level. And it goes on and on and on. If we were to gather all the words in here with the size of this room, easily we would have had 60, 70 words describing what it means to be a leader today. And when you sit back and listen to all those and understand all those words, they're all accurate. And what it means to me is we have very high expectations of anybody in a leadership role. And then I sit back and I go, can any one person do all those things? Is it possible? But that's where we are today. It's a big role, and it's a sense that we need leadership to be at its strongest than ever before. And yet, at a time when that's the case, there's enough research to suggest that that's not happening. Some research shows that for employees, they're disappointed with a lot of the leadership that they see. Studies show 3 out of every 4 employees say that their manager or their boss is the worst or most stressful part of their job. 66% of employees, when given a choice between a new boss or a pay raise, more money, they take a new boss. Staggering. So there's probably HR leaders in here, and you're worrying about how to manage your compensation costs. What that research says is you don't have to pay people more if you give them a better experience of leadership. Leaders are frustrated and disengaged. Gallup did a large study that found 65% of leaders are disengaged. And many don't care about their company. I don't know how you can be successful as a leader if you ultimately don't care about your company. And the bad part that we see as well is what happens almost on a weekly and monthly basis, where leadership has become disgraceful. Senior leaders, maybe they're high-profile politicians, maybe CEOs of large companies, embroiled in scandal and corruption, ruining the reputation of their company, ruining their own reputations, and that's got to change. But there's something more fundamental happening that's actually more subtle, that has to do with accountability, and that's what I believe is the biggest challenge before us. And to show you that, I'm going to just show you a quick video clip. I am Canadian. I'm not American. A lot of people, when you do this kind of work, think, oh, he must be American. I'm Canadian. I live close to Toronto. And this is actually from one of our clients a few years ago. So this is just a group of executives having a meeting. Have a look at how they do.
This is a big problem we have here.
It sure is.
Yes, it is.
Big problem.
Competition is killing us.
That's true.
Very much so, yes.
They really are.
We need a new strategy.
We sure do.
Strategy will be good.
Totally agree.
I need new people.
Yes, you do.
New people.
Definitely.
New people.
That's the solution right there. New people.
So what can you tell about this company in this 30-second little commercial? They have no chance. You don't need to read their annual report. You don't need to talk to the CEO about their strategy. You don't need to understand what analysts are saying about them in the market. you can see these leaders in action and realize they're not accountable and they're not going to drive the success of this company. You have no confidence. You already know that. Now, they're nice people. Maybe you'd have a coffee with them. Well, they're Canadian. Of course they're nice people. We're nice people. But you don't have confidence in them. And you can imagine the kind of environment they're going to create for employees. You can imagine how successful they're going to be not. And so the real issue that we're facing is one of leadership accountability. We have too many leaders in leadership roles who simply don't understand what it really means to be a leader today and are not stepping up to demonstrate strong leadership accountability. And how are we defining this? Well, what's really interesting is accountability is a word in the English language, but it doesn't exist in many other languages. It doesn't exist in Spanish. But as we've been talking to our clients all over the world, they say, we don't have a word for accountability, but leadership accountability is our problem. And how are we defining it? It's when leaders really own their leadership role, their whole leadership role, not just the technical parts, but the people part, the culture part, the organizational part. You've got to own your whole role. Number two, you have to lead in a real deliberate and decisive manner. Those leaders are not decisive in that video. They're not deliberate. And you have to bring a sense of urgency to your role, so you're always helping the organization move things forward so it doesn't get stuck. So we were starting to see this issue of leadership accountability surface, client after client. So we decided to say, to understand, is there something happening more broadly among companies? So our first study, we partnered with a very respected American organization of senior HR leaders to look at, is leadership accountability a problem? And we found almost 3 out of every 4 survey respondents from global Fortune 500 companies said that leadership accountability was a critical issue, and only 37% were satisfied with the degree of accountability being demonstrated by their leaders. We saw that and we realized, okay, there's something happening here. So we've been collecting data more broadly, and we have some data from Colombia. So if you open your little folder here from Lee Hecht Harrison, you have this to take away for you. It summarizes our research. I'm going to just spend a quick few minutes going through what we found. We had 63 companies respond to the survey, and 65% of them believe that leadership accountability is a critical issue. Not the 75% we've seen in North America, but still 2/3 of the respondents. Only 21% are satisfied with the level of accountability being demonstrated by their leaders. That's not a strong number. 45% believe they've set clear expectations of leaders. And this is what we're finding is actually a critical step for organizations. Many do not set expectations of leaders in a clear way. And so it becomes hard to hold leaders accountable when you haven't told them, here's what we expect. 24% believe only 24% of their leaders are truly committed to their roles, and 37% believe they have a high-performing culture. Not good enough. One of the things we wanted to look at is there a connection between top company performance and accountability? And there appears to be. We asked the respondents to self-identify in the survey, is your company a top quartile performer in your industry relative to competitors, or are you an average or below average performer? And when we sort of split the data, what we find is, and the blue represents the top performing companies, some interesting differences. So greater belief that leadership accountability is critical among the top performing companies, more satisfaction with leadership accountability. Look at the difference, 36 versus 6%. 36 is stronger, but it's still not strong enough, in my opinion. And 45% believe is that this is the number, about half of their leaders are accountable, versus the poor performing companies, which is just 22%. So this shows us that there is a connection between strong leadership accountability and top performance. And it's obvious, right? You're not going to drive high performance when your leaders are mediocre, like in that video clip. It's just not going to work. Not today. We asked them, okay, you know who the leaders are, who are truly accountable. What is it that they do differently day to day that set them apart from others? So we can define it behaviorally. And here are the top 5 that emerged in the survey we did in Colombia. The first is that they build the skills, the leadership skills of their teams. That's what they invest. You know, a lot of leaders think that they have to do everything themselves, but really, strong leadership is only a function of how strong the team is that you've built. They invest in their own development. That's really important. They hold everyone to high standards of performance. Number 4, they're not afraid. They have the courage to tackle tough issues and tough challenges and make difficult decisions. A lot of leaders want to be liked, and sometimes that plays with them. They won't make a tough decision because, well, what if my employees won't like me? You're not being accountable if you do that. And finally, they're very effective at communicating the strategy throughout the organization. Because once your employees are clear on what it is that they do and how it contributes to advancing the business, then that's a basis of holding them accountable as well. We also wanted to find out, what do top performing companies do to build leadership capability? And there are 5 differences that emerged between the top performing companies and the average or below average companies. So first, they set a clear strategy and communicate it. They also set clear expectations of their leaders, as I said before. They bring the voice of the customer into the organization, so everyone's clear of what's important to the customer. That they develop their leaders, and that they find ways to bring leaders together so they can network and build relationships. And I'm going to talk more about that later. So what's the way forward? How do we address this problem of leadership accountability? I believe it begins with this concept of a contract. And what does that mean? Think about it, right? As you had your conversation with your colleagues here, you identified a number of words that define leadership. And as I said, they're very high expectations. And that's what we do as human beings. Anytime we meet someone or see someone who we define as a leader, maybe it's the CEO of a company, a high-profile politician, maybe it's a teacher, maybe it's someone in the community who's a leader. Anytime we think of someone as a leader, we immediately hold them to a higher standard of behavior. We expect more from leaders. We always have. And that, to me, implies a contract that when anyone takes on a leadership role, you have to understand there's a lot expected of you. We're counting on you to lead this company, to do something important in the community. But a lot of leaders don't really appreciate that they've actually signed a contract. It's been implicit. I think it's always been there, but I think it's been implicit. But a generation ago, when the world was simpler, it was okay. But today, when the world is more volatile, more changing, more complex and more uncertain, we need leaders who really pause and reflect on what it is that they've taken on. But what I think has happened for many of us is we get into leadership roles because we're really good at something technical. You're a great engineer, a great analyst, a great accountant, a great salesperson, and strong individual contributors always get recognized. And how do we reward them usually? Well, you're such a great salesperson. Here's a team of people now, good luck. And off you go. And now you're on a management track. And you stay on it because that's the track that in most companies pays the most money, has the best titles, and that makes perfect sense. But to me, the analogy is a lot like this. You know when you're online conducting any transaction? Usually there's a window that pops up with the terms and conditions. And when you're like me, when I'm really busy and I'm trying to get many things done at once, do I ever read the terms and conditions? No, I just click agree and I move on. I know I'm bound to something. I'm not quite sure what it is. I just hope that in the future, Apple doesn't come and take away my 3 kids sometime, you know? My wife would not be happy with me. It was in there. Didn't you read it? No, sorry, I didn't read it. Studies show 93% of us never read the terms and conditions of online contracts. I don't believe that. I want to meet the 7% who claim they do, because I think they're lying. I have never met anyone, and it's always the lawyers in the room that put up their hands. So the lawyers are reading them. But here's the analogy. The analogy is we take on a leadership role because a company comes to you one day and says, you're a great engineer, here you go. Oh, okay, click agree. Then you get another promotion. Okay, I'll take it, click agree. But you never really pause and think about that there is a leadership contract, and it comes with expectations that you have to fulfill. And there are 4 that we talk about. The first is that leadership is a decision, and you have to make it. What does that mean? You have to really think about what you're signing up for and define yourself through the leadership role that you have. In a lot of our leadership programs, we have participants who say, yeah, I'm an engineer by training, and that's how I still see myself. I see myself as an engineer first, even though I have a leadership role. In fact, leadership is my part-time job. And I'd be happier if HR just dealt with all my people issues. No, that's your job. You have to own your whole job, and you have to make the decision to be the leader. What it also means is that you have to know yourself well enough to say, maybe leadership is not for me. Maybe the way I'm going to add the best value is by being a strong technical performer. And that's a pretty good decision to make, to know yourself and have that level of maturity. Leadership is an obligation, and you have to step up. Once you decide to be a leader, you recognize that there's a lot of expectations, and you have obligations to many, many different stakeholders, customers, shareholders, your employees, the communities in which you do business. And certainly the expectation today is that leaders are seen as stepping up to those expectations. If you think about the leaders embroiled in scandal and corruption, they have forgotten this. They have somehow lost their way and forgotten that leadership is an obligation. And the obligation is to leave your company in better shape than you found it. Leadership is hard work, and you have to get tough. What do we hear from a lot of our clients who are frustrated with leaders who are not accountable? Our leaders are afraid to give direct feedback to their direct reports. Our leaders don't manage poor performers. They let them go for months and months and years sometimes. Our leaders are afraid to make a bold decision. We don't have leaders in companies, if those are the things they're afraid to do. But every time you avoid that hard work, you don't realize that you weaken yourself, weaken the people you lead, and weaken your company. And so we have to build the resilience to tackle those things. And finally, the new model of leadership is that it's a community, and you have to connect with your colleagues. What does that mean? It's thinking about building a strong leadership culture where all your leaders are truly aligned to the strategy, where they're enthusiastic and excited to be part of the company, where the leaders set a high aspiration to be great as leaders, where they come to work with what our clients say, a one company mindset, always never losing sight of the entire company as they work. Where they're kind of responsible for holding each other accountable. That peer accountability is critical. Where they celebrate success, where they collaborate, where internal politics are not the main thing. They push those to the back to focus on making the company successful. Where they have resilience, and where they genuinely support each other and have high trust. This is what we see over and over again, CEOs telling us, if we can build this, this will differentiate our company. So how do you put these ideas into action? At an individual level, leaders must respond, and they have to embrace the 4 terms of the leadership contract at a very personal level. But organizations also have to do some work. First off, you have to make leadership accountability a critical issue in your company. And those of you in here who are leading HR, you have a perfect opportunity to start having this conversation with your leaders. Bring this into your executive team and talk about how do we think we're doing compared to this data. Are we stronger? Are we weaker? Are we the same? Start having that conversation. You have to set expectations of your leaders. Be very clear on what does it mean to be a leader so everyone knows that what you expect is critical. You have to stop tolerating the mediocrity and the unaccountable leaders. That's what we've uncovered when we go into a company and we say, so, let's talk about this. And everybody knows who the unaccountable leaders are. We all know, but we choose not to do anything about it. We're not helping our companies when we tolerate that. And finally, we have to find ways to bring leaders together to network and build relationships. And as we saw, that was a critical practice of the top performing companies here in Colombia. So, let's just wrap up quickly. These ideas. What does it mean to be a leader? A very important question that we're all asking ourselves at a personal level, at a company level, because what it means to be a leader is very different than what it was a generation ago. The expectations are higher, and we really need leaders to be truly accountable at all levels. It begins by understanding that there's a contract. It's an important job. It's not an easy job. Well, it is easy if you want to be mediocre. It's hard to be consistently good and one day even great at it. And finally, it comes with 4 terms. It's a decision, you have to make it. It's obligation, you must step up. It's hard work, you have to get tough. And it's a community, and you have to connect. So let's pause here, and we'll move to our next part. Does that work for everybody?
Sí, muy bien.
Perfect, thank you.
Muy bien. So, muy bien. Muy buenos días. ¿Está funcionando? Pero está prendido. On, sí. ¿Aló? ¿Listo? Muy bien, muy buenos días. Muchas gracias al doctor Juan Carlos Linares por la invitación a compartir con ustedes algunas reflexiones, algunas ideas sobre liderazgo a través de una entrevista, una conversación con el doctor Vince Molinaro. Bienvenido a Colombia. Es un honor, un placer tenerlo acá. Es una figura indiscutible desde el punto de vista académico y práctico en materia de liderazgo. Tiene un libro estupendo que le recomiendo mucho, El contrato de liderazgo, que va a ser traducido a español, esperamos en los próximos meses, lleno de consejos prácticos, de sugerencias muy útiles para desarrollar el liderazgo en sus organizaciones. Varios puntos prácticos antes de entrar en materia. Voy a sostener la conversación con el doctor Molinaro en inglés para evitar las traducciones, micrófonos, audífonos, bueno, eso complica todo. Sale más fluido si hacemos la conversación en inglés. Les pedimos el favor de que vayan anotando sus preguntas y cuando tengan el papelito listo levantan la mano y va a haber asistentes en el salón recogiendo sus preguntas. Yo voy a seleccionar aquellas que sean más representativas de las inquietudes generales de ustedes. Y por último tenemos una hora exacta, o sea, a las 9:15 vamos a estar terminando la sesión. Yo creo que la primera media hora van a ser preguntas, diálogo, intercambio con el doctor Molinaro y en la segunda parte ustedes tendrán la oportunidad de hacer sus preguntas a través de la selección que yo haga de sus inquietudes. Pues sin más preámbulos, entremos en materia. Muchas felicitaciones por su presentación, doctor Molinaro. Muchas gracias por su libro. Bienvenido a Colombia y esperamos que sea la primera de muchas visitas. So now let's switch to English. My first question is, most of the people here present today are HR leaders. And they have a new responsibility in this new world, very competitive world. Which are the main changes in the role of human resources in relation to leadership? Traditionally, HR has been a support, has been a service provider, but my impression, and after reading your book, I have the confirmation, HR has now a different role, a more strategic role, a more active role, a more dynamic role. Could you please explain how do you see the new imperatives of human resources?
Yeah, I'll start with, I'll share a client story. She was the head of HR in an energy company. And she joined, she was in the company, got promoted to be the chief human resources officer, and it was her first executive meeting. And there she was in the meeting, and the CEO was a very tough individual. And they were talking about a business issue, and he was going around to each of the executives. What do you think? What do you think? What do you think? What do you think? And it came to her, and he said, what do you think? And she said, oh, no, I'm just HR. I don't have an opinion. And then he said, wait a minute. If you're on this team, I expect that you have an opinion about the business. I need you not just to be an HR practitioner, I need you to be a business leader. And that, I think, is what's changed for HR leaders, is that there is that expectation to be strategic, but to really understand the business and show up in that way. But that has to also reflect on how your team shows up, how you present yourself as a leader. And I think sometimes that's where HR leaders miss an opportunity. We're so focused on building the leadership in everyone, we forget about our own leadership and the leadership of our teams. So I think it's a really exciting time for HR leaders to demonstrate strong business leadership and actually be role models for their companies.
Vince, you mentioned the new idea, this very interesting concept of community leadership. And you described very succinctly the characteristics of this community leadership. My question is, which are the main obstacles to develop this concept in an organization, and how do you overcome those obstacles?
Yeah, there's a few obstacles. First off, organizational structure doesn't help, right? We have to create structure somehow, often via functional areas or a line of business, and sometimes that creates silos that prevents leaders from connecting with one another. What's really interesting, though, is when we are brought in a lot to work with, say, the top 2 levels of leaders in a forum, and when you have 100, 200, 300 leaders in a room, whatever that number is, and we say to them, how can you build more community? What's really, really surprising is they don't say things like, we got to change the structure. And you know what they say? I'm going to pick up the phone and talk to a colleague. I'm going to get out of my office and actually walk down the hallway and see someone face to face. I'm actually going to bring someone from another department into my own team meeting so we understand what we both do so we can work more effectively together. So a lot of times with community, there are structural changes or challenges, but oftentimes it's the mindset that needs to evolve. Too many leaders have been conditioned to just focus on their silo, but the really, really good leaders don't let those silos influence them. They're always thinking horizontally, always looking to build relationships. And then the second barrier is we think that the solution is more complicated than it actually is. And that's, as I say, it's surprising to me how simple those things are around building relationships that form a strong community. In the book, I talk about sort of 5 ways, and that's why I talk about connect, right? So here's a dramatic example, and I still don't understand how this is possible. But I was working with an organization in Canada that was in the science-based industry. So they were all scientists, all PhDs in there, very, very smart people. And here we were with the top 50 leaders having an event. It was the first time the company brought the top 50 leaders together. 2 leaders had been with that organization, each of them, for 7 years. It was the first time they had ever met face to face. And I sit there going, how is that possible? You are working together on really important projects. You're the top 50 leaders of the organization. How do we allow those things to happen? Well, why? Because they expect the CEO or the head of HR to create the forum. They don't need the forum. They told us they were separated only from 1 floor from each other. In 7 years, no one ever said, let me get out of my office, take the elevator down, say, hey, let's go grab a coffee. No one ever thought to do that. So it's the mindset that we need to evolve to.
Vince, but let me pose to you this practical problem. In an organization, in a traditional organization, you have these very strong leaders, traditional leaders. He or she are the heroes. They have the solutions, they give instructions, and everybody else is a follower, basically. And then you come with your idea. Now we're moving into community leadership, okay? So now it's about collective discussions, about empowerment, about lots of things that change completely the reality of the exercise of power for these people.
Yeah.
How do you deal with this transition from the individualistic leadership to the collective leadership, and how do you deal specifically with these persons, which will react negatively and will try to avoid change?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think what we have to understand is it's not either or. I think we need strong individual leadership, and we need strong collective leadership today. So I don't think you have to make a trade-off between one or the other, number one. Number two is what we've learned is you can't underestimate how many leaders actually have, even if that's the way they've led, how they actually desire for a sense of community. Because when you talk to those leaders, they feel isolated, they feel lonely, and they feel disconnected. And we have research that really supports that. We worked with one organization where we were working with the top 120 leaders, and we sensed that leaders were feeling kind of isolated, disconnected, and that they wanted a little bit more community. So we said to the CEO, before this meeting, we want to propose this idea that these leaders will meet in small groups of 8 or 10 on a monthly basis, a conference call. that they will talk just about leadership, not about business issues, just about their leadership. And he said, I don't know where they're going to find another 12 hours in a year, but okay, I'll let you put that out there. They completely accepted the idea, and now they ran it for a year. Once a month they met. They did it all. We didn't do anything. 120 divided into 12 teams. And they, at the end of the first year, they said, now we're going to continue. Now we're going to change the teams around. And now they're on their third year. That's complete accountability. Nobody forced them because they find they get a better experience of leadership. They feel more supported. So I think the change is probably not as difficult as we may think, because that's what people really want. That's what leaders want. They're feeling too isolated and disconnected day to day. They want a better way forward. The other thing we know, in a style that is more, say, directive, maybe autocratic, as you talk about, those leaders are getting pressure from the new generation, right? I mean, I sit there sometimes and I think in my own leadership role and I go, it'd be so much easier if people just did once what I asked them to do, right? Because why are we doing that? How does that connect? Good questions. And so you really find that model is being challenged because you've got, like, particularly with millennials, smart people coming in saying, wait a minute, what about this and what about that? No one just does anymore what they're told to do. Our employees are really strong, and there's a new set of values. I don't know if that's common to anyone else's experience.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Vince, you mentioned in your book and your articles and your interviews a very powerful idea, a very powerful concept, and I would like you to elaborate, to explain further in detail this very interesting idea. Leadership culture is your ultimate differentiator. It's not a product, it's not a service, it's not a strategy, it's not your organization, it's this leadership culture. And how do you build this leadership culture?
Yeah, so really when we define leadership culture, sorry, hold on. When you define leadership culture, it goes back to that slide that I showed with those 10 elements. And as I said there, that's what we have found in our work. CEOs saying, if we can really build that, that's the ultimate differentiator. That's what our competitors will not be able to copy. Because, strategies today can be easily copied. There are fast followers, there are disruptors. You may have a point of competitive differentiation or competitive advantage, but everyone that we work with says the time you can really take advantage of that is shorter and shorter and shorter. So they're kind of thinking about what's truly sustainable, what will differentiate us. And that's it, because in the book I talk about 3 types of leadership cultures that are not effective. One is like a zombie culture, where leaders show up every day just like zombies, right? No energy, no passion, no engagement, no commitment. The ones we also see a lot of is cultures like a racetrack, where everyone is kind of very competitive with one another. Sometimes I've worked with companies where the competition inside the company is far worse than what that they face in the marketplace. It's crazy. And it's all completely manufactured. And that's the part, right? We can create it. We have to certainly be clear about what it is. I remember once working with a client where they were struggling with their performance, and we worked with the top 80 leaders, and they were lost. The CEO didn't know how to turn it around because he realized he couldn't do it by himself. He needed his leaders. And they just had become zombies. And it was a tough 2 days of working with that group. And I remember on the last day, I was in the parking lot putting my stuff in my trunk of my car, and I closed my trunk, and I looked up, and there was the office tower. And I exactly knew where their offices were. And from down there, you look up and you go, oh my goodness, they can turn around their situation immediately, because from down here, everything they've created it. They created the zombie culture. They created the internal competition. So what? Guess what? They can create something that's going to change them. And then it really requires the aspiration, the commitment, and you've got to bring leaders together, and you've got to set that's the expectation. This is what we aspire to. This is what we're going to strive. And some leaders are not going to come with you. And you have to address that. You have to address that. That's the hard work of leadership, right? And you know that if certainly for the HR leaders in here and the CEOs, you know what that's like.
Vince, key ingredient for this leadership model that you are proposing is trust. And in Colombia, we have a very serious problem. Levels of trust in Colombia are amongst the lowest in the world. We don't trust each other, we don't trust our neighbor, we don't trust our boss, we don't trust our leaders, we don't trust anybody. That's a product, a consequence of many problems we've had in the past. So how do you build this trust? And what destroys this trust, and what gives more strength to this trust according to your experience?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting you say that because, you know, I'd want to throw the question back to everyone saying, so why? Tell me why is that an issue with trust? Because, you know, there's also studies that show that you are the happiest people on the planet. So what does that mean? Is that low trust leads to happiness? I don't understand. So maybe we need to ask some questions of the audience. In one of our earlier books, we talked about trust, and it's actually deeply personal. And it has certainly a few levels. The first level of trust is, I trust you to be competent. Right? I trust you to be competent in what you do. The second is, I trust you that you will do what you say you're going to do. Right? And the third is, I trust that you will have my back. That is, that you will defend me when I'm not there, as opposed to, you know, not defend me or to undermine me. And any one of those things can be violated, right? So think about it with a colleague, right? If I say to Juan Carlos, I am going to do this, and then I don't, what's happened with the trust? Now, if we've built a relationship initially, then he might give me a chance. But if I do that 3, 4, 5, 6 times, the trust is eroded. And I think that's ultimately what sometimes people, and it gets back to community and connecting, right? Is sometimes leaders underestimate that you've got to build the relationship first. Because if you build the relationship first, and you and I, something happens, because, you know, business is demanding. Sometimes we'll be conflicting with one another. We'll have priorities that don't, you know, that misalign. That happens all the day. And so sometimes, and that may not be anything to do with what you and I do. We're just in circumstances that challenge the trust that we have. But if I have a relationship with you, I'm going to make an assumption, well, Maurizio, no, I know him. That's not how we think. So something else has happened here. And I'm not going to jump into, that's it, I'm never going to talk to him again. So I think we try to have trust when we don't have relationship, and it doesn't work.
Very, very good suggestion. Yeah. Now let me talk about this leadership contract. There's an element, one of the building blocks that you propose in your book, which is the idea of leaders mastering complexity, volatility, and uncertainty. That's a fact of life in modern times. The degree of complexity, volatility, and uncertainty is amazing, and it's increasing. It's getting worse and worse. That generates lots of stress, that generates lots of tensions. How do you learn to cope with this very different environment?
Yeah, I think there's a subtle thing that's happened when that environment has changed leadership. So a generation ago, when things were simpler, your sense of who you were was really based on your expertise. You actually knew things, and you knew the answer to things. In a world as you describe now, you're not so sure, right? And so what that means is you have to be open to saying, I don't know. But that actually goes against how many of us have thought about leadership roles. Right? Where you always have to have the answer, you always have to appear invulnerable, you can't show any weakness. And now I think we're all going to be challenged because we don't know. We don't know how the world's going to change. And where it really comes down, and I write about this in the book, is I had a professor once in one of my graduate courses, and he was a great thinker. And I asked him in one class, I said, you know, what's the one question you have learned that if you ask the question, the answer will tell you a lot about an organization? And he said, ask this. How is asking for help viewed in the company?
Wow.
Right? Imagine that. If you create a company where asking for help is shown as weakness,
You have a problem.
you have a problem dealing with ambiguity, and because everyone's going to, pretend they know something that they don't know. But if it's seen as a sign of strength, it's a completely different company on your hands. Now you are better positioned. And I think that's why community is important, because I'm not going to have all the answers, but if we get in a room collectively, we'll probably have the answer. We can manage it collectively. We can manage the ambiguity collectively. Individually, it's demanding.
Very interesting.
Yeah.
Vince, let me move now back to accountability. There's a related subject which is very important, and you have written extensively about this, which is performance management.
Yeah.
How do you tie these two concepts?
Well, at a conference I was at in New York City, there were the two topics that were what every HR leader wanted to talk about. The first one was leadership accountability, and the second one was performance management. And what's been really interesting over the last 2 years, and I'm not an expert in performance management, so I need to say that. But what has been interesting for me observing it is it feels like to me, I don't know when the day was, but it seemed like there was a day when every company just woke up and said, we're going to blow up performance management. That's what it looks like has happened. So at that conference, there were 3 heads of HR, CHROs, of very large global companies who said, we've blown it up. And now we're putting all the responsibility on the employees and the managers. And I immediately go, wait a minute, we've gone way to the opposite extreme here. Because for all of that to truly work, the level of accountability that's going to be required among leaders and among employees is staggering. And that's where I think we should be. But I think that, what are they saying? Well, it's not going to be an annual meeting. It's going to be more regular touch points. I'm not convinced that's going to happen either. Let's be honest. Particularly when you have leaders who are part-time leaders and would prefer that HR does that work rather than they do it themselves. So to me, it gets back to, okay, if we've moved the pendulum here, that's fine, but we better help leaders understand they're accountable now for having career conversations, for having regular feedback. That's what's going to make that work. So to me, I see that connection between accountability and performance management. It's really curious to see what's going to happen. I'm very to see what this experiment is going to be like.
Vince, let's talk now for a few minutes about individual leadership. Which are the new skills, the new talents of a modern leader? What has changed over time according to your experience and your analysis of successful leadership?
Yeah, well, I think it gets back to Vika, right? It gets back to the world. And what we need now of our leaders is leaders who are more externally focused, right? Too many leaders show up every day, their head is down, they're working hard, but then you miss things. So we need leaders who are more curious about the world to understand what's happening, and so they can anticipate better. So that's what we hear our clients. How do you anticipate more effectively? The second part is how do you shape? How do you build relationships with key stakeholders? How do you move people along so you can influence them effectively? Because as we said earlier, few people are going to just do what you tell them to do today. So you really have to be able to influence them. And then it's how do you execute effectively? What we find, a lot of leaders jump immediately to execution, and they forget about being kind of anticipating and the shaping. And then when things don't work out, then they realize, oh, we missed a step, we got to go back. So to me, that's how I think about it. How are you thinking about your world? How are you anticipating? How do you shape situations? And then how do you ultimately execute? Which, in many cases, that's where some strength exists in leaders. But the other two, not so much.
My last question before I move to the questions from the audience. It's a practical question. I see a lot of happy faces interested in these concepts, but I guess that all of us are thinking, okay, fine, I like these ideas, I like these concepts, I would like to try them in my organization, but how do I approach this with my boss, with the president of the organization, or the executive committee, or the board of directors? in practical terms, which are the steps you recommend? How do you start this conversation? Do you do an internal survey? Do you, of course, hire Juan Carlos and you to go and give a talk? How, in practical terms, do you sell this idea of the leadership contract, of building a leadership community, of making leadership a key differentiator for your company? It's not easy because these boards and these bosses have lots of ideas and lots of alternatives. How do you make your case?
Yeah, so the first, I'll answer kind of the how, but the first thing that we've observed is among CEOs, accountability is always a critical concern. So you don't need to spend a lot of time selling that issue. They're trying to figure out, how do we drive greater accountability? It's with every CEO that I've worked with. So they're waiting, whether it's for the executive team or for an HR leader, to come with an answer, right? Because that's their top of mind concern usually. Then I think what I shared is that there are two parts. Individually, we have to embrace the leadership contract. So in the book, I talk about, and this was actually inspired by a client. When I wrote the book a few years back, I had given him a copy of the manuscript to review, and he said, I really like this. I'm going to ask myself 4 questions every day, tied to each of the 4 terms. So he said, what's the decision I have to make today as a leader so I'm fully committed in my role? Number 2, what's the obligation I have to live up to today so I'm clear that I'm leaving my company in better shape than I found it? What's the one hard thing that I'm going to tackle? And if I do, I know I'm going to make the company stronger, not weaker. And what's one relationship I'm going to build with a colleague so that we form a sense of community? And as soon as I got those questions, I said, these are great. Can I include them in the book? Because I know everybody's going to want to hear about them. And I did. And to me, that's a powerful way of just ensuring that you will not get complacent, that you will always make accountability a focal point. And so it starts with yourself. So that's the one part. I think then organizationally, it gets back to what I talk about, what we present here on this sheet. And I think this is where HR leaders have a real important role is, have part of a meeting with the executive team to say, what's our sense around leadership accountability? Look at this data that we have from Colombia. How are we stacking up here, right? To me, that's a practical conversation, in my opinion. And then there's there's really 3 things that I learned, and I was asked this at a conference one at the end, where the final question is, what's the one thing you would advise HR leaders to do? And what I came back with is, I can't say it's one, but what we've learned is you have to set clear expectations of your leaders. All of our research globally suggests less than half of the companies are doing that. So that's easy to start. Number 2 is we have to stop tolerating the mediocrity. We have to stop. It's not easy, but we have to stop. And 3, you've got to find ways to bring leaders together. And these things are really supported by our research, right? By what the top performing companies are doing. So that's how I would answer that.
Very good, thank you very much. This is the first of your questions. It's a very good question. How do you introduce and make sure this concept of accountability becomes a practical reality in day-to-day life in your organization when you are working for a political organization, an organization in which politics play a very important role and everybody's playing games and power games and alliances and who's against you and in favor of you, etc. And there's not a real culture of performance oriented to results, etc., etc. You have politics in the way, which is quite common in Colombia and in Latin American companies. So how do you move from a political organization to an organization where leaders are held accountable for their performance?
Yeah, I don't think I have a good answer for this one. And let me explain why. I understand at times when organizations have, we're not naive. We're human beings. Politics exists everywhere. But when that becomes the focal point of an organization, it really does become a real barrier to move towards accountability. And so, and I had a real example with a client. It was a municipality. It was the government of a city. And they internally did a lot of work with the leadership contract. Everything we could possibly do, we worked with them. So they were big fans, and they embraced it and started to transform the organization. The leader of the municipal government said, I want you to work with our politicians. And I said, I don't think that's going to be a good idea. And she said, no, I want them to embrace the ideas, because if we can have the politicians and the organization, we'll be powerful. And I'm loyal to her. I said, okay, let's give it a try. And of course, the politicians can be only politicians. That's not a criticism. That's just what is. And so it was very difficult to have conversations about accountability, right? It was very, very difficult. In fact, we did one day, and I said, I can't accept your money anymore. Like, I just can't. I don't think this is really going to work, like it does in an organization where there's a sense where that goes. That's why there is a statement around community of leaders where leaders put the politics to the background, because ultimately it's about the company. And so I think in those situations, you have to find who are your allies, who see things like you do, and where you can form your own community and you can lead in a different way. You can start with your personal accountability, and you can build a small group of people who share that, and that sometimes can be the beginning of change. Or you have to analyze and say, is it possible, and is this the place I need to be? And if you feel like it isn't, then you have a different decision to make. So I don't know if that's a good answer, but it's probably a
good try.
It's a great question. Thanks for giving me the hardest question, first one.
Very hard question. Yeah.
Yes.
Excellent question. Very good questions. This is another very good, interesting question. Do you think that we are moving from the traditional concept of CEO, Chief Executive Officer, to the concept of a Chief Talent Officer?
Yeah, I think I react every time. To me, that sounds like it's kind of a fad or something. Because ultimately, if we go back to the first part of the definition of leadership accountability, all leaders need to be chief talent officers, right? It's an important part of our jobs. And what we have is too many leaders who don't pay attention to that part. So, yes, the CEO should be the chief talent officer, but so should a frontline manager, so should a middle manager. It's not just that person. We need every leader to be the talent officer.
Next question. How do you measure the value of leadership in the market, in the market cap of organizations, being this concept such an intangible asset?
Yeah, you need a broader set of measures, right? Because if you kind of just look at financial performance, stock price, margin, EBITDA returns, you can drive those by doing everything opposite than what I talk about, right? You can have a very, one client in particular, a CEO came in, and this division of the company was the cash cow. And so the board said, you need to drive profits. And this leader drove profits, right? Drove profits. However, after 4 years, unfortunately, the board realized that there were problems. Number one is there was no capital investments. So this was a food services company. They had facilities making food where the roofs were leaking, things were breaking down. There were safety issues because he said, you want me to make money? I will make money, but I will not invest in capital. So now they've got a significant $1 billion, they've got it, there was 4 years lost, right? Employee engagement was like in the sewer because he didn't pay attention to it. He just drove his people hard, and employees who need jobs and want jobs will do that, but it's not sustainable. So I think we have, so to me it's a broader set of measures. Financial performance is critical. What's the strength of your culture and employee engagement? Do you retain people? Do you have people that you have that pipeline of leaders? That's the broader set of measures that we're seeing boards hold more CEOs accountable to, and in turn CEOs holding their leaders to. What it also means is not tolerating, as a client said, high performance and bad leadership, right? And that's the problem with this work, right? The problem with all of this is, for every example of a great company who figures it all out, I can show you a company of an example where they're successful financially, but there's a lot of bad leadership. That's just how life happens. Right?
How do you teach or motivate your leaders to accept that they made a mistake and to learn from their mistakes? Because normally leaders tend to be arrogant. They are successful, they're doing well, performing well, and it's not easy to deal with mistakes for them. But you need to create this culture of accepting that somebody made a mistake and to derive from that experience lessons to avoid the mistake in the future, etc. How do you create this environment?
Yeah, I like the way you're describing it. It really is an environment, because with a lot of organizations, they talk about, we need risk-taking, right? But the first time someone makes a mistake, whoop, they're out the door or they've demoted. And you know what? Everyone remembers that forever. And so it is the environment, which is people will make mistakes. And so do you see it as a spirit of learning? Now, of course, you know, these things have huge financial implications. You've got to address that. But I think it is about creating that environment where people are open to be vulnerable, but also that they mitigate the risk, right? That they're not going to make a big bet that's going to really hurt the company should something not work. So that's the accountability of leaders to manage, right? They can't be reckless in how they're operating day to day.
You mentioned that leaders now have to be more connected to external players and external variables and to be more sensitive to what's happening around them in the community, in the world, because of the influence that this has in companies nowadays. But how do you move from this internally focused approach to this more open approach? And how do you create the interest and the need to do so in leaders in your organization?
Yeah. So I think, again, it gets back to individual and organizational. So individually, you know, you just need to be observant. You need to be curious, right? Read papers, see what's happening, just understand trends. We just do that all ourselves, right? That helps. Organizationally, what's really interesting is, and I thought it was interesting in the data here, that an organizational practice was really helping leaders understand what customers value, right? Because understanding what your customers value really brings focus to an organization, brings focus to decision making with leaders. But here's what's really interesting, what we've seen in practice. Sometimes you kind of say, well, who collects data about what our customers value? Sometimes, usually, it's the marketing function. And what we've often found is that those insights are rarely shared broadly with leaders. So that, to me, is easy to fix, right? Share that data more broadly, and now you're helping leaders get clearer on what value, because not every leader has a customer-facing role, right? So a lot of times you need to look at what are the practices you have in place that might be, may be getting in the way of something really simple. We've had that with clients where our customers are not, our clients are not our leaders are not customer focused, and then you say, well, are you sharing the data? No. Well, start sharing the data. That's easy to do, right? So again, these solutions are not always complicated. It's just making that commitment. Again, individual and organizational.
Next question is more a personal question, a very interesting question is, all of us leaders face from time to time crisis, difficulties, and we feel insecure about the quality of our leadership. How do you face those moments? What do you recommend to sort out things when you feel that you don't have control of the situation, that you're lost, that you are not as powerful as you thought you were?
Yeah. Wow, great questions, everyone.
Very good questions.
So this issue of insecurity is really, really interesting. A while back, in 1 week, on one day, I spoke to a group of CEOs. And 2 days after, I spoke with a bunch of MBA students. And it was so fascinating to have those two events in 1 week. So with the CEOs, they talked about, the VICA world, and they talked about how it makes them feel insecure. and how they're always uncertain about what it is. So I think we have to understand that insecurity is a reality of leadership today. But we're always told that you need to be strong and vulnerable and whatnot. But I think we just have to accept that that's okay. I think we have a sense that it's not okay, or I'm always going to be confident. It gets back to this hero model, right? But even heroes are a little nervous at times, right? So I think we just have to understand that that's okay. That's okay. Don't get too stressed out over it. And now just focus on controlling as many as the variables that you can to be successful. That's how I think about my own role, right? When I met with the MBA students, they were brash, arrogant, I'm going to take on the world, and I was like, let's give them a few years. I love the energy, but they weren't talking from an experience base.
Of course.
But this issue of insecurity, now, there is a negative side to the insecurity, and I do want to call it out. There is a legitimate insecurity that comes with a more complex world. But there's also a personal part of insecurity, and I talk about it in the book. And this actually emerged in Europe. A question I got in Europe was, we have managers who hire people that are weaker than them because they're afraid that strong people will take their jobs. So it's a job security issue, right? A strategy, sorry, not an issue, right? Or insecurity means you will do things as a leader to make yourself be liked by your people. And I say in the book, if you want to be liked and we all want to be liked as humans, but if you have a high desire to be liked, it's going to really play havoc with you as a leader. Because sometimes you have to make unpopular decisions. You have to sometimes do things that are in the best interest of your company. And some of your people may not understand because they won't have all the context. And you need to have the courage to do that. So it's important when we think about insecurity to realize you'll always have moments of insecurity. That happens. At the same time, don't let the negative parts of insecurity cloud you, because if you're hiring weak people, you're not doing anyone any favors. You think you're going to have job security, but you're fooling yourself.
Very good. Una buena noticia que me dice Ángela. Vamos a rifar unos libros de Vince. Aquí llegaron 20 libros. Y Juan Carlos, yo no sé usted cómo los va a rifar, pero me dijeron que usted va a ser el encargado de la rifa. Pero al final, porque si no, se nos van con los libros. Entonces esperemos a concluir la entrevista. Pero bueno, regresemos. Let's go back to a related question, insecurity, and you mentioned the word. This great problem in modern society for people and for companies, stress. Everybody's very stressed. And you can notice, you can feel the stress. And organizations, as collective organisms, are also stressed. And you can notice that when you're talking to the people, not only as an individual phenomena, but as a collective phenomena. And the question here is, how do you deal with stress? We all know that stress up to a certain point is necessary.
Yeah.
You need this adrenaline to make things happen. It's important. But beyond certain point, the experts say it becomes destructive for your health, for your mind, for your personal life,
Yeah.
and for performance and leadership.
Yeah.
So how do we deal with stress?
Well, I mean, there's a lot of excellent experts and books written about this. In the book, I touch about it. I touch on it when I talk about resilience and resolve. Right? Is that it is a demanding role, and we need to build the resilience. But sometimes leaders, I have someone on my team who's like this. She is so hardworking, always has her head down, and takes on everything. And yesterday, I had a chat with her, and I needed to kind of talk her, we have this phrase, talk her off the ledge, because she just had everything come to her. And I can see her, and it's like I really try to help her. And how I help her is I give her moments to vent, right? And so what we know from the research is social support is actually a powerful way of helping us manage stress. Good. But if you feel isolated, if you feel disconnected as a leader, you don't have that mutual support, right? So I have a sense of who has your back. Who are the colleagues that you can go to say, can I knock on your office? Okay, I need you for 10 minutes. Can I lock the door? Okay, I just have to vent. Okay, and you know it's a safe environment to do it. And you're not complaining, you're not whining, the stress builds up and you need an outlet. Okay, thank you, now you move on. And the next time you do it for them. That's one way. In a more proactive way, it's the stuff we all know about, right? You got to exercise, you got to eat right, you got to manage, manage your health properly. But I think the part that we also have to come back to goes back to the 4 terms. If you are truly passionate about being a leader and have made a decision, and you have a high aspiration to be a leader, I think that helps you manage the stress because you recognize that it is a demanding role. But if you're a leader who's unaccountable, it's not a job that you're passionate about. If you are like those 65% of American managers in that Gallup survey that are disengaged, everything's going to be stressful. Everything's going to be stressful. So that's a different issue. That's not a stress issue. That's a career issue. You need to first think, are you in the right environment? Are you in the right role? Because sometimes not being in the right environment and being in the wrong role creates a lot of stress. Right? So that's how I would respond to that.
A related question, this personal matters. In your view, how can we help our leaders to show their vulnerability as a strength instead of as a weakness?
Well, for that one, what's really helpful is when senior leaders set the example. Right? Where they set the example. And it comes into saying, yeah, at times I feel insecure, but I don't let it affect me negatively. Or, we made this decision, but realized it was the wrong decision. So we quickly changed our direction, and now we're on the right path. Once you see senior leaders being open about their own invulnerabilities and being humble about it, that changes a lot for other managers and leaders.
Back to accountability. What's the difference in practical terms between accountability and responsibility?
Yeah, it's a great question. The way I think about it is, responsibility is something that is thrust on you. You have a responsibility to be the CFO and make sure the company's finances are in check. Or you're an engineer of a power plant and you need to make sure that the lights are always on so the power plant operates. That's a responsibility. Accountability is what you take personal ownership for. And that's how I distinguish the two, that commitment.
Very good.
Yeah.
That clarifies the question, the issue. Another very good question. How do you identify potentially accountable leaders? Which are those characteristics, those traits, those demonstrations of this potential? Yeah,
so in the book I write about that. And I think what we have to do is we have to kind of evolve from what we've traditionally done, which is looking for strong individual contributors with strong technical expertise. And we have to now start looking for accountability. And we haven't really done that. And when you start looking for accountability, you'll start seeing it. Think about the people on your own teams. You can very quickly say, wow, this person shows up to work and is accountable. And you can compare that with other people who might be okay performers, but just don't bring that extra level of commitment and accountability. So I think, and not to oversimplify, but I think we just have to start looking for it more than what we did in the past.
Again, related to accountability, this concept of accountability is very interesting, very important, but it also portrays some risks and some dangers. This can create a culture of pointing fingers and scapegoating. How do you avoid not exaggerating this accountability drive and making everybody kind of schizophrenic about this?
Well, it's you imagine when we've gone into clients to talk about the leadership contract, right? And leaders are sitting there going, do I have to sign something now? They get a little nervous.
Yeah.
That's okay. That's okay, because it's important to get people to understand this is an important role and you need to be accountable. I think what you're referencing, and this actually came out when I was in Europe, they said that in Italian, they don't have a word for accountability in their language. But the way they think about accountability is through a negative lens. So if something doesn't work, they want to know who's accountable, which is a blaming view of accountability. So next week I'm in Italy. We're launching the book in Italian, so it'll be fun to challenge those Italians around that word, right? Because if that's how we view accountability, there's an aspect of it which is just factual. Yes, who was accountable for this situation? But if that's the only part of the definition, then we're not going to really get there, right? That's not certainly how I intended it as I wrote about it.
This is a good question for us who teach and are forming the leaders of the future. What changes would you implement in the education system, in the education model nowadays to make it possible for these concepts to grow in the future, to flourish, to develop in the future?
It's a great question. So I've observed something really interesting with young people. And by young people, I don't mean millennials, because they're primarily in the workplace already. I'm talking about those who are still in elementary school, high school, normally referred to as Generation Z, right? Generation Z. And my children are that. So I use the example in September, that's when our school year starts, and she's in grade 8. And every year, the students get an agenda where they record their homework. It's a book that they bring back and forth from home to school. If we want to write a note to the teacher, we can. If they want to write a note to us, they can. And on the cover of this agenda was the word leadership. And underneath this text was the qualities that we talked about earlier: inspiration, courage, all those things. I think Generation Z is a generation that is being thrust with expectations of leadership. And I think for them, I think that's all they're going to know. So my daughter's school, every month they give a leadership award in the elementary school, where they acknowledge 5 or 6 kids for demonstrating leadership. So already, that was never the expectation when I was in school. That wasn't even the expectation when I started working, right? And so I think what's going to be interesting is to see what happens when that generation enters our workplace, where all they know is leadership. I think that's just going to how they operate. I think they're just going to be accountable. I've got 3 kids, 2 boys and a daughter. My 2 sons have already had, they're 16 and 18, more leadership development than I probably have had in my career, right? So I think it's a very different expectation that they're going to have. They're not going to see it as, oh, this is a job I have. They're going to see it as who they are. And I think that's the difference. So I'm curious to see what's going to happen, but and I think it's even different than millennials. I think some millennials have had that expectation, but not all of them. So
good. Last question. When you describe the elements, the ingredients of the leadership contract, you use a very powerful phrase. The company is me. I am the company, which sounds great. I mean, but it's difficult to make people shift their mindset from an individualistic approach to a collective approach of being really feeling that they are the company, that they represent the company, they are the company. And in many cases, what you find is lots of people that are alienated from the company. I have a job, I get paid, I have a responsibility, I do my best, and that's it. I'm not the company. I'm just...
Yeah, and I have a view on that where I can understand employees having that perspective. Yeah. I think if you're in a leadership role, you can't, because we expect more, right? And so what it really means is, and I write about this in the book, a story of a client who shared with future leaders this idea of, that sometimes leaders say, when they're particularly frustrated, if this company just did this, if this company just did that, if the executive team just did that. Well, every time you're doing if this is that, you're not being accountable. You think this company just exists. Well, how does it exist? No, it doesn't. You are the company. And if you accept that, it completely changes how you think about your role. So you no longer are a complainer. Now you're part of the solution. It doesn't make it any easier, but there's no company out there that's perfect, where everything operates perfectly every single time. Problems arise, and it's the job of leaders to tackle that. But if you think, oh, the company will just fix this magically, nothing's going to change. If you say, I am the company, to me, that's the beginning of that accountability and taking ownership.
Bueno, acabamos de disfrutar de una maravillosa charla sobre liderazgo. Muchas gracias al doctor Vince Molinaro por estas lecciones de liderazgo, por estas ideas, estos consejos, estas sugerencias. Realmente muy valiosos sus conceptos y de nuevo muchas gracias por compartirlos con nosotros. Muchas gracias a Juan Carlos por esta invitación. Un aplauso. Excelente. Wonderful. Maravilloso.